Hi, I'm Henrik Mortensson, and this is the second part in a three-part review of the book Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pe. Now, in the first part, I talked about the purpose of the book and some of the core ideas like cognitive load and Conway's law. I recommend you start with part one if you haven't seen it yet. The next topic that the book dives into is heuristics for organizational design, and I consider these to be pretty good actually. A heuristic is a guideline we can use to make a decision quickly when we do not have the time or the data we need to fully investigate a situation. So there are two types of heuristics in team topologies, patterns and anti-patterns. Now, patterns are generic guidelines about how to do things that are beneficial to us. Anti-patterns are the opposite, things to watch out for so we can avoid them. The book lists organizational anti-patterns first, so I'll do the same. The first anti-pattern is ad hoc design. It's a situation where we just respond to a problem without thinking it through. Ad hoc is unfortunately the default design mode in most organizations. Here are a few examples. For example, splitting a team that has grown too large without considering the impact on architecture, team communications, and the psychological health of the team members. And a second example, creating functional teams, like a team that takes care of all COTS software or a database administration team created after a database crash, for example. Um, The next anti-pattern is shuffling team members around between teams a bit willy-nilly. This includes assembling teams for a specific project and then disassembling the team afterwards. Heavy outsourcing is also an anti-pattern. It's related to shuffling team members around. One-way flow processes, in other words, waterfall and waterfall-like processes, is also an anti-pattern. Now, you have an opportunity to test yourself here. Many organizations do the things I have just listed. Can you figure out why they are bad mistakes? You don't have to solve it alone. Bring in the same co-workers that will help you with your reorganization efforts. If you have difficulties figuring out one or more of the above, then the skill prerequisites I talked about in the first episode are probably not fulfilled. By the way, if bringing a couple of people together to do a fairly basic management exercise like this seems a difficult thing to do, then you may not have the collaboration and learning culture that is one of the implicit prerequisites for using team topologies effectively. At the very least, it's worth considering. Now, when I work with organizations to do some kind of improvement, lack of prerequisite knowledge often crops up as a major blocker to change. Not always, but often. Let's talk about more beneficial patterns in the book. One of the recommended patterns are cross-functional feature teams. Such teams can be a great asset, but they do require that the developers are well trained and have a high degree of skill. Product teams are similar to feature teams, but a single product team owns an entire product. Product teams will often need support from other teams. Site reliability engineering teams are also one of the patterns mentioned. Now, an important point here is that technical skill levels, engineering practices, and organizational culture place constraints on the team structures you can use. So these factors must be considered. Okay, let's move on to another important insight in the book. Tool choices drive communication patterns. The book does not provide examples, so I'll give you a couple of my own. If you want to ensure plenty of miscommunication of anything suitable for visual communication, remove whiteboards or at least force people to use very small ones. Prohibit the use of tools such as Miro and Mural to prevent members of distributed teams to communicate effectively, and also to inhibit communication between teams at different locations. If you want to delay communication of requirements between users and developers, make everyone use Jira or a similar tool so you can build infinitely large product backlogs and thus get infinite lead times. If you want business presentations to be sleep-inducing snorefests and ensure that nobody catches glaring mistakes and possibly blow up a spacecraft, use PowerPoint and provide templates for bullet point text presentations. If you think I'm exaggerating, I'll give you just one real-world example of how using the wrong tool can obfuscate communication and cause disasters. On the 1st of February 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry into the atmosphere. The 7 astronauts aboard all died. As it turned out, NASA management had been warned that this would happen in a presentation before Columbia was launched. Now, this was the PowerPoint slide the engineers at NASA used to warn managers about the problem. Can you see what the problem is? The NASA managers couldn't either. They looked at the slide title, Review of Test Data Indicates Conservatism for Tile Penetration, and drew the conclusion all was well. This is the important information. Volume of RAM is 1920 cubic inches versus 3 cubic inches in for test. This is not very clear either, but it means that the volume of debris that could fall off and damage the shuttle during launch was 1920 cubic inches, but the volume used to assess possible damage in test was only 3 cubic inches. This meant the test was not only useless, it was severely misleading. The slideshow was reviewed by Professor Edward Tufte, an expert in communication at Yale University. He found that the design of the PowerPoint slide obfuscated the information on it, and the design of PowerPoint shaped the design of the slide. So I've seen plenty of business presentations that are, from a communication perspective, as bad as this one. Some are text only, others have a bunch of boxes communicating nothing on the slides. There is good reason why I did not use PowerPoint as a presentation tool in this video. When I do use PowerPoint, I use other tools and a presentation method to create the illustrations I present without falling into the traps created by PowerPoint itself. Team Topologies expresses the idea that tool choices affect communication patterns in an abstract manner without concrete examples. So you need to be mentally alert when you read it so you don't miss the implications. It's worth noting that while Team Topologies covers the communication pattern angle, it does not mention the equally important process perspective at all. The book does make the important point that it's a big mistake to force everyone in an organization to use the same tools. The requirements and context are different in different parts of the organization, so forcing everyone to use the same tools make no sense. Now, I fear most organizations will miss this point. One thing that bothers me a bit is that Team Topologies sees sustainable pace exclusively as a function of engineering practice maturity. Engineering practice maturity is part of it, but you also need management practice maturity. In the case of sustainable pace, you need to understand such things as pull processes versus push processes and why batch transfer size is important. And also one thing I've noticed in many organizations, you need to get managers to not bypass the processes and cause chaos in the teams. That's something that happens a bit too frequently for comfort. Again, the book sins by omission, but the omission of processes and the importance of processes is pretty large omission. Team Topologies makes a shallow dive into metrics and recommends tracking dependencies and wait times. And this is good, but it's not nearly enough to be sufficient. What metrics you need to track is actually context dependent, but the book doesn't mention this. nor does it connect metrics to goals and behaviors. In short, it makes some good points, but also all the common mistakes. For a better approach to metrics, I'll actually recommend one of my own books, Goal Maps. In the book, I show an approach to metrics where you first determine what your objectives are using a goal map, then determine what behaviors are likely to move you towards your goals, and finally decide which metrics you need to check if the goals and behaviors model you have really works in practice. This gives you a metric system that makes it clear whether you move in the direction you want or not. It will also show you if there are mistakes in your ideas about what to do and how goals are related so you can fix them if necessary. Speaking of mistakes, Team Topologies suggests a categorization system for dependencies. And this is a little bit dangerous because you cannot know in advance how to categorize data collected from a complex system. It's better to collect the data and then organize the data into categories. That way, you won't miss or miscategorize stuff, at least not as often. An important and correct point the book makes is that you must let team topologies evolve. A good topology to begin with is not the same as a good topology to use a year or more down the line. Team topologies defines 4 fundamental team types: stream-aligned teams, enabling teams, complicated subsystems teams, and platform teams. Now, I have watched at least half a dozen YouTube reviews of team topologies, and they all make the mistake of locking in on the team types and ignoring pretty much everything else, including most of the points I've brought up, and how the teams are supposed to interact in different situations. Don't make that mistake. Always bear in mind the purpose of these team types is to either reduce or distribute cognitive load and though the book does not mention it, total workload. Also, the book skips the design of the development process the teams will execute, and this is a fatal omission unless you have this knowledge from some other source. For example, if you create a team organization that is great in theory and then implement a push process or fail to implement a pull process correctly, the team organization will not help. This example shows a situation where we have a good team structure, but we used a push process instead of a pull process, and push processes have no mechanism to balance the workload between the teams, and this means queues of work will build up between the teams. Increased queues means increased delays in the process. It also means the developers will get cognitive overload when they try to reduce the queues by working faster, rather than taking control of the process and limiting the queues. In this situation, having a great team topology won't help you. You need to get structure and process to work together. This is the same team topology as before, but with a pull process. The pull process puts the developers in control of their workload and makes it possible to shrink the queues and therefore also shrink lead times and reduce cost of delay. The lack of a basic process model may be the greatest flaw in the book. If you have a high variation process like software development, it doesn't matter how well you structure teams and team communication if you do not have a mechanism for regulating flow in the work process, because you will almost inevitably overload the process and torpedo all the organizational work. So please get this one right. Or, better yet, since I am a consultant, please get it wrong and then call me to help you fix it. That will help me pay for food, clothes, rent, books, and the occasional movie. Also help me keep continuing making videos like this one. So, at this point, team topologies goes into expected behaviors of the different team types, but it's a bit short on advice about how to actually get teams to behave as desired. For example, for some teams, in some situations, team topologies recommends intense collaboration. But what this is varies depending on organizational culture and the experience and skills of individual developers. Developers who have worked with Scrum will probably have a very different point of view from developers that have worked with extreme programming. And both of these groups will have different views from managers that are used to new product development. At this point, you might start to wonder if the silly exercise I recommended earlier really is as silly as you thought at first. The problem is that coming to an agreement is not enough. You have to agree on the right thing. And I'm sure everyone will figure this out. So, back to the plus side. I do like the approach the Team Topologies takes to defining boundaries of responsibility for teams. Part of it is using domain-driven design to define bounded areas of responsibility. Another idea is to use fracture planes, planes that can easily be decoupled from each other. A manager I know and I made a walkthrough of the fracture planes idea, and he quickly identified a fracture plane that could be used to create boundaries of responsibility for teams in his organization. Now, that particular manager knows a lot about software development and the systems architecture too. So I'm not certain just any manager could do that. The book then goes into the problems with standardizing the wrong things. Standardized office layouts are used as an example. And that's very well done, I say, because that's something that often happens in organizations. Um, Here's a brief rant. I once made an economic model based on productivity loss due to having a bad office layout and found that the company lost productivity to a value of more than twice its net profit each year. In other words, it could have tripled its net profits by having a better office layout. Um, the company checked the calculations and drew the conclusion that I was right, and of course they didn't change anything. End of brief rant. Team Topologies gets this one absolutely right, even though it does not go into much detail. Now again, some prior knowledge is probably required to understand why it's a bad idea to standardize the wrong things. Or you could just listen to the famous management expert Frank Zappa. Without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. And that's all in this episode. Team Topologies continues to be a mixed bag with brilliant insights tightly coupled to fatal omissions. In the third and final part, I will talk about Team Topologies' views on how teams should interact and some insights about this we can get from military strategy. Why accidentally drinking from someone else's cup of coffee can be a good thing, and a hard team topology rule that unfortunately is wrong, and how team topologies accidentally identifies a problem with its own topology model, and missing communication modes in team topologies. We will also talk about why you might have to fire your accountants to get team topologies to work, and why the section on clarity is not clear at all, and how 2 old books might help you make sense of team topologies. So, be seeing you. I'll get back to drinking coffee.